Tonight we continue a series that we began some weeks ago in raising the question, is it a sin? And we're raising the question of, is it a sin to dance? Is it a sin to drink? To engage in premarital sexual relationships? To engage in homosexuality? To wear short attire? Those questions we seek to cover and supposedly some more. So tonight we want to look at this question, is it a sin to gamble? Probably no one present this evening is guilty of gambling, hopefully not. But this could serve as a preventative measure to understand why this gambling indeed is a sin. We want to raise this question before we start, as we've raised each time, what constitutes sin? And this particularly applies to this question tonight, as with some other questions. And that is, we need to know what constitutes sin. What makes something sinful? Sin is a violation of God's law. 1 John 3 and in verse 4 said that whoever commits sin transgresses also the law, for sin is a transgression of the law. When God's law is violated or transgressed, that constitutes sin. We repeatedly made the point it does not have to specifically be stated. In other words, here is some practice that we don't have to find a passage that says, thou shalt not, or this is sinful. But if that practice violates a Bible principle, then it constitutes sin because it transgresses the law of God. And so as we seek to answer this question this evening, we're going to raise the question, what constitutes gambling? What is it that we're talking about when we talk about gambling? And furthermore, is it sinful? And if so, why? Can we prove it to be a sin even though the Bible does not specifically mention that? And furthermore, how can betting $2 on a horse or $5 on the lottery be wrong, and yet losing $1,000 in the stock market not be wrong? Is there a difference? We'll answer that question before we get through. Can it be justified on the basis of the revenue that it generates? For example, the lottery. The revenue that it may generate for the state, the good that may come from it, or a raffle raising money for maybe someone in poverty, does that justify that because of the revenue that is created? I want us to begin by looking at the fact that this is a widespread problem. We'll look at some modern statistics, and I'm going to look at some older ones that really haven't changed that much. But I want to suggest to you that this is not just an isolated problem, that there are a few people who gamble, but it's a widespread problem. One statistic suggested that $500 billion a year in the United States is spent on gambling, more than the combined expenses of Medicare and Medicaid. That's astonishing. That number is outdated. It's much higher than that. It's interesting that in 1963, lotteries were banned in every state. And now almost every state has a lottery. Things indeed have changed. Store owners in California reported the decline in grocery sales equivalent to the sales of lottery tickets where they sold the lottery tickets. You stop and think about that. I was living in the state of Kentucky when they introduced the state lottery. And when they did that, there was the same kind of report going on, where grocery stores were saying that we're selling lottery tickets, and that whatever amount we're selling in lottery tickets, our grocery sales are going down by the same amount. That's interesting, where the money might be coming from. One report suggests that 75% of all high school students have gambled. Those are some older statistics. Let's get a little more modern. Last year, a year ago yesterday in fact, this article appeared in the U.S. News and World Report that Americans bet $125 billion on sports in the last 4 years since the U.S. Supreme Court legalized it in every state. That's a lot of money, telling us it's a widespread problem. Here's a couple of other quotations. One that in Arizona, in February of this year, bettors in Arizona wagered $609 million on sporting events, including the mobile apps and in-person sportbook facility and off-track betting locations. That's just in that one state alone. Another report says that according to the UN report, the amount wagered on illicit betting markets has been pegged somewhere in the ballpark between $340 billion and $1.7 trillion annually. Indeed, it is a widespread problem. But let's go back in time. This is not a new problem. This is not something that's just come around in the last 50 years or maybe the last 100 years, but we go back even before the time of Christ, gambling indeed was a problem. The Greek in Homer's time used knuckle bones of sheep and goat and used them as dice for a game of chance. Gambling boards were found in Crete that date back to 1800 to 1900 years before Christ. So this is not a new problem. In Babylon, headless arrows were used for making wagers. I won't read the entire quotation, but a quote from Grolier would suggest that ancient Egyptians played a tep, which was a game of guessing numbers and of upheld fingers. And others played some kind of game of chance, and they would wager on that, suggesting this is an ancient problem. This is an old problem that has been around for a long, long time. So let's start with this. If we're going to talk about gambling, I'm convinced that we have to spend a little time defining what gambling is. Because someone comes along and they say, well, I know what gambling is. Gambling is taking a risk and taking a chance, and that's what makes it wrong. But there are other things that are taking a chance and taking a risk. To make those kind of equivalents leads in one of two things. It either leads to accepting gambling because we accept all kinds of other risk, and that's all it is taking a risk, they think. Or we condemn anything that's a risk. And so it's wrong to take some kind of risk, for example, in business. You can't do that because that's gambling, and gambling is wrong. And both of those extremes miss the mark. Let's define gambling, because that's where the key is in understanding what's wrong with it, is understanding what it is. The American Heritage Dictionary says gambling means to bet money on the outcome of a game, contest, or other event. Quite simplistic definition. Grolier's encyclopedia said, gambling is wagering of money or other valuables on the outcome of a game or other event. Very similar, a little more information. The World Book Encyclopedia said, gambling is the betting on the outcome of a future event. Gamblers usually bet money or something else of value as a stake on the outcome they predict. When the outcome is settled, the winner collects the loser's stake. I like that definition. I want you to look at that one again and look for some elements that are involved in that. Look for 3 elements involved in gambling. Because every form of gambling that you can think of will fit that definition. Let's go back and read that again. World Book Encyclopedia said gambling is betting on the outcome of a future event. It means it's uncertain. Gamblers usually bet money, that's a wager or a stake or something else of value, on the outcome they predict, and when the outcome is settled, here's the third element, the winner collects the loser's stake. All right, let's look at those 3 elements that we just listed. First of all, in gambling, there is some uncertain event. It might be the playing of a game. It might be the cards that is there played. It might be the rolling of the dice. It might be which horse is going to win. It might be on which team is going to win the Super Bowl, etc. A number of things that are uncertain. So there is an uncertain event. Number 1. Number 2, there is a stake or a wager. This is money or something of value that's agreed upon before that uncertain event is settled. The third element is there is a winner and a loser built in. And so if it's just the 2 of us involved, or it may be 100 of us involved, we put up a wager on some uncertain event. Who's going to win this game? That's the uncertain event element number 1. There is the stake or the wager, and then the winner takes all that comes from the loser. So you have those 3 elements that are involved. Well, let's put those 3 elements to the test, and let's take a look at that. What might be involved in that uncertain event? Well, it might be a card game, such as poker. It might be a ball game, might be a basketball or a football game or a soccer game or some other kind of event. It might be a horse race or a dog race. It might be the rolling of the dice. It might have to do with the drawing of a ticket or raffle ticket. It might have to do with matching numbers, matching coins. That's the uncertain event. The wager may involve a bet. It may be the price of the ticket, the raffle ticket. It might be the price of the lottery ticket. That's the wager that has come forth. And then the third element that you have is the winner and the loser built into that. When those 3 elements are there, we have gambling, as we are talking about in our study this evening. Now, let's talk about what's not gambling, and we'll give more evidence of this later. I just want to list it at this juncture. Taking a risk is not what we're talking about. When someone takes a risk, for example, farming involves a risk. A farmer, a modern farmer, may borrow $250,000 or $500,000 to put out a crop on a big farm. That's a big risk. And so he puts all of that in seed and in fertilizer, and he plows the ground and he plants the seed, and there is a risk that he may not make that crop. So there's a risk involved. That's not what we're talking about. You might have risk in buying stock. You buy something of value. You might buy stock in Walmart or some other company, and you're taking a risk. It may go up, it may go down in value. The same thing in adventuring in business. You may borrow some money and you decide, I'm going to start a business. And you're going to try to sell. You may buy something in order to turn around and sell it and make a profit. You may end up losing money. There's a risk involved. We're not talking about taking a risk. You might be involved in a risk in crossing the street. But a risk is not gambling, as per our discussion of our study this evening. Furthermore, insurance. Some have equated that with insurance. When you're buying an insurance premium, you're hoping to gain something from that. Well, not necessarily, because you're hoping to gain only if something bad happens. You have a wreck, or you have a fire, or some other event. So buying insurance is not the same as what we're talking about of those three elements involved. You don't have the winner and the loser built in. Furthermore, prizes. Some have equated prizes with that. That's not the gambling that we're talking about. For example, you just put your name on a card, drop it in the box, and they draw out the winner, and you win the prize. They have a drawing. It may be at a grand opening. You haven't put a wager in, and so there is an uncertain event, all right, but there is no wager that's involved. And so that doesn't fit the bill, and we'll say more about that toward the end of our study. We're still trying to define gambling. I want to suggest to you that it is not determined by size or by degree. Evidence of that is a quotation from Gamblers Anonymous website itself. The Gamblers Anonymous said, gambling for the compulsive gambler is defined as follows: any betting or wagering for selves or others, whether for money or not, no matter how slight or insignificant, where the outcome is uncertain or depends upon chance or skill, that constitutes gambling. By their definition, if you have a problem with gambling, if you are a compulsive gambler, they define it. This is Gamblers Anonymous. Said gambling is not determined by the size of the wager. So it might be that you're gambling 50 cents, or it might be $50, or it might be $50 million. That doesn't determine whether it's gambling or not. It has to do with those three elements that are involved. Now let's talk about different forms of gambling. Because some people have the idea that gambling involves playing poker, for example, or betting on the horse. But I'm doing this over here, and those three elements are involved, but I never thought about that being gambling. Let's talk about different forms of gambling. Gambling may come in the form of playing cards. Not all cards is gambling. Not all playing poker is gambling. But if it's for a wager, if there is that card game where there is a wager, then we have gambling, if you have those three elements. It might come in the form of a horse race. Not all horse races involve gambling, but certainly that could be involved in, for example, the Kentucky Derby and others. The dog race, the same thing, or maybe playing the lottery, buying a lottery ticket. Whether it be putting $1 down or $5 or putting $10 down. The lottery ticket, playing the game of bingo that involves a wager and a winner and a loser in those three elements. Buying raffle tickets. There may be a truck they're going to give away, and you buy a raffle ticket for $100, and you think, man, what a great thing if I win this new truck and I've only spent $100 to win that truck. You have those three elements, and that's involved in gambling. You might have slot machines. You might have not only slot machines, but playing roulette. Or it may involve such as the pitching or matching coins or betting on sports, which is quite common in our day. Or it might involve buying chances and playing some of the games at the fairs, which involves those same three elements that we talked about a moment ago. It comes in various forms. When those three elements are involved, we're involved in gambling. I'm more interested in this principle, so let's spend some time talking about the fact that it violates Bible principles. You know by now that we're not going to find a passage that says, thou shalt not gamble. If it did say that, then that's going to raise some questions. What's involved in gambling? Is taking a risk? No, the Bible then lays down some principles, and let's see how that works. You've seen this before in this series, but I want to go back and emphasize Luke chapter 7. In Luke chapter 7, I want you to see how Jesus taught. Jesus taught by implication. That he took some principles and thought we should learn from those principles and draw conclusions from them. What's going on in this occasion? This is when John's disciples, John sent his disciples to Jesus. He called his two disciples to him, or two of them, and sent him to Jesus, saying, I'm reading at verse 19, are you the coming one, or do we look for another? And when the men came to him, they said, John the Baptist sent us to you, saying, are you the coming one, or do we look for another? Now, that's a simple question. He could have said, yes, I am the coming one. He could have said, I'm not the coming one. That wouldn't have been true, but he could have said yes or no, but he didn't say either one. Here's what he did. And at that very hour, look at verse 21, he cured many of their infirmities and of the evil spirits, and many blind he gave sight. And then Jesus said, go and tell John the things you've seen and you've heard. Tell him about the miracles you saw. What I want you to notice is there was no direct statement. But rather, he suggested that here is some evidence from which you draw the conclusion. You want to know, am I the coming one? I work this miracle. I work that miracle. I work this miracle, and I work that miracle. You draw the conclusion. What are they to draw from that? The question is, are you the coming one? He responded with miracles. The conclusion was, he is the coming one. Now we know more than the answer, he's the coming one. We know why he's the coming one. We know the evidence of that, and we see the miracles. All right, let's start with some evidence of the things, the Bible principles that are violated by gambling. Number one is gambling can be and often is addictive. I don't mean to imply by that the person who gambles this one time has been addicted to that, any more so than taking drugs one time means they are addicted. But gambling is addictive. Let's give some evidence that it's addictive. You've heard of Alcoholics Anonymous. Do you realize, I mentioned a moment ago, if you didn't catch it, that there is an organization called Gamblers Anonymous. Now, why is there a need for Gamblers Anonymous? That's because gambling can be addictive and becomes addictive. Evidence of its addiction is the fact that crimes that is bred by that, and we'll talk more about those in a moment, to support the addiction. Many of those who are involved in gambling, compulsive gambling, are involved in crime to support that gambling habit that they may have. 1 to 2% of the population are said to be compulsive gamblers, according to Gamblers Anonymous. In a book called Theft by Consent, that's an interesting title to that, we'll say more about that in a moment, said that for many these problem gamblers, the source of their trouble is the lottery. Of the 40,000 calls to the Council on Compulsive Gambling National Hotline in 1996, fully 52% were from adults addicted to playing the lottery. What does that prove to you? It only proves that it can be addictive. That's all we're wanting to see. Now let's open our Bibles and go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 is talking about the sin we dealt with in our last study, and that's the sin of fornication. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul argues that all things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but I'll not be brought under the power of any. His argument is, even if fornication were to be lawful, that doesn't mean it's expedient. Even if it were lawful, it's not to have control over you, as it did with many people at Corinth. So here's the principle. We're not to be under the control or the power of anything other than God himself. Meaning if something is controlling me, it's addictive, it is now controlling me. If it's fornication, if it's some other sin, if it's drugs, or if it's gambling, if it's addictive, I'm under the power thereof. Well, let me give you another passage to think about. In 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 5, it violates the principle of self-control. We're to add to our faith virtue, to virtue knowledge, knowledge temperance or self-control. And so if I am addicted to gambling, I'm not controlling myself. If I'm addicted to drugs, I'm not controlling myself. And so if it's addictive, then therefore it violates those Bible principles. It also violates the principle of the condemnation of covetousness. It involves an inordinate desire for gain. I want to quickly gain something, and I want to gain it without giving or without work. So I want to put my money down, for example, the lottery, buy a lottery ticket and hope to win several $1 million without me having to work and without me doing anything other than spending that money that I spent on the lottery ticket. It seeks to win at the expense of others. And that involves covetousness. I'm willing for others to lose so that I can gain. So all of those that lost is my gain because I won the millions of dollars in the lottery ticket and buying that lottery ticket, but others lost. I'm willing to do that. Let's go to Colossians chapter 3 and in verse 5. Colossians chapter 3 and in verse 5. Here are some things that are to be put to death. It means kill it. You end it. Put to an end to that. Therefore put to death your members which are on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Let's go to another New Testament passage, this time in 1 Timothy chapter 6. Go to 1 Timothy chapter 6 and look at verse 10. Verse 10 says, "For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil." That's covetousness. "For which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness," or covetousness, "and have pierced themselves through with many sorrows." So what's wrong with gambling? Well, it can be addictive. It involves ourselves in covetousness. It violates the principle of love. How so? It violates the principle of love because we're unloving toward those with whom we wager. So I make a bet with you that team will win. I'm unloving because I want to take your money from you, however much that you may have wagered. If I'm able, I'll take all that the losers at the loser's expense. That violates the principle of love. It is theft by consent. Remember that title of that book a moment ago? Theft by consent. It is stealing by consent. And someone said, "Oh, that's silly. If they consented, that's not stealing." Well, let's think about dueling. If you have a duel, that's murder by consent. Is it any less murder? He consented that if you can shoot first, you can kill me. But if I can shoot first, I'll kill you. Is that murder by consent? Well, certainly that's murder by consent. This is stealing by consent. It violates the principle of the golden rule. As you would that men do to you, do even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets. And so it violates that principle. I'm doing unto others that I don't want done to me. I don't want them taking my loss. Furthermore, the principle of love, that we should love our neighbor as ourselves, is violated. We're not loving them as we are ourselves. But here's another principle that's violated. It violates the law of stewardship, or the principle of stewardship. Let's talk about stewardship for a moment. We are to be good stewards. We won't take the time to read every passage here, but I want to read a couple of these. Let's take 1 Peter chapter 4. That's a good sampling of the rest of these texts. 1 Peter chapter 4 and in verse 10, "That as each one has received a gift, minister to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God." God expects us to be stewards of the things that we have. Well, 1 Corinthians chapter 4 says much the same thing, that we are to be stewards. See the same thing in Luke chapter 12. God expects us to be stewards. Now, gambling is poor stewardship. You say, how do you know that? Would you want your money manager to handle your money that way? It doesn't matter how much money you have. You may have $100 that needs to be managed. It may be 100,000. It may be 100 million you have. Whatever amount that you might have. Would you want to turn that over to someone and they say, "I'll tell you what I'm going to do with it. I'm going to spend this on lottery tickets. And I'm going to buy some raffle tickets with it. And I'm going to bet on some horses with that. I'm going to manage your money for you." Would that be good stewardship? Is that how you'd want them to spend your money? Would you think that's being good stewardship? The odds of the state lottery are 1 in 12 to 14 million. You compare that with the same kinds of odds of being struck by lightning, which is 1 in 1.9 million. You have a greater chance of being struck by lightning than you do of winning the lottery. That's not good stewardship of the blessings that God has given us. But here's one of the things that's sometimes missed in the matter of gambling, the principles, and that is that it violates legitimate means of transfer of money or goods. The Bible states some principles that here is how we can legitimately transfer goods or money from one to another. Let's see what those are. There are 3 that I want us to mention. First of all, there is labor. And that is where money is paid or earned for effort extended. So if you hire me to do something for you and you pay me, then that comes under this matter of labor. I hire you to do the same thing. We won't read all of these passages, but let him that stole steal no more, but let him work with his hands, that he may have to give to him that hath need. He's working for the money. He's earning that money or getting that money by labor. That we read about wages being paid. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and in verse 8. That should be 1 Thessalonians 3 and verse 10. If a man won't work, neither should he, or 2 Thessalonians 3:10 is correct, will not work, neither should he eat. So if a man wouldn't work, neither should he be eating. So he should work for the things that he has. And the same kind of principle we see in Luke chapter 10. Now, gambling doesn't involve gaining by labor. So when I put my wager down and I gain or lose, as the case may be, I'm not gaining anything. I'm not seeking to gain by labor. That's one legitimate means of transfer. Here's a second means, and that is a means of exchange. This is where a commodity is exchanged for something of value, maybe money or other goods. We see this principle like in Acts chapter 4. That's a good sampling of that, where people had lands and they sold their land. So they transferred the land and they received money in exchange for the land. They sold that. Buying and selling involves this principle of exchange. Matthew chapter 13, in the parable, a man finds a field where there is a buried treasure and he buys that field. He exchanged money for the field. There is the law, the principle of exchange. Now I said we'd come back to this. This is where stocks and insurance fit. It fits under the legitimate means of exchange. When you buy stock, it may go up in value, may go down in value, but you buy something of value, just like buying a house. You buy a house and pay $100,000 for the house. It's worth $100,000. Next year, it may be worth $150,000, or it may be worth about $75,000, depending on what goes on in the market. So there is some chance involved, but you bought something of value. It fits this legitimate means of exchange. Same thing in buying stock. You buy $5,000 worth of stock in Walmart. It may go up in value, may go down in value, but you bought something of value. You receive something of value in exchange for your money. The same thing is involved in insurance. You're buying protection. You're buying something of value. It fits under this legitimate means of exchange. Gambling doesn't involve exchange. There's a third means of transfer we can read about in the Bible of exchanging goods or money, and that is love or a gift. This is where money or something of value is given without any expectation of something in return, like helping the needy. Let him that stole steal no more, but let him labor with his hands, that he may have to give to him that hath need. Ephesians chapter 4. So we give to the needy. We see that in Acts chapter 2. See it again in Acts 4. See it again in Acts 6. See it again in Acts 11, where people were giving to those in need. They weren't buying something of value. They're just giving it to them to help them out. A matter of benevolence. Inheritance may fit into that category. So here's someone that inherits. Maybe it's only a few dollars. It may be hundreds of thousands of dollars they inherit. The Bible principle of inheritance is found in Numbers 27 and Deuteronomy chapter 21. We may give a gift to someone. It may be a gift that you're giving them as a present. It may be helping them because they are indeed in need. Prizes would fit into that. So you go to the store and they're having a grand opening and you put your name in the hat and they draw it out and you won the prize. They gave you a gift as a means of advertisement. That would fit into that category. And so it violates the legitimate means of transfer. It doesn't involve labor, exchange, or love, or a gift. Now let's talk finally about it breeds other sins. One of the things that's wrong with gambling is that it breeds other sins. Now what do we mean by it breeds other sins? Well, Jesus made this statement, by their fruits shall you know them. He was talking about false teachers, but here's a general principle. The fruits of anything tells you something of its nature. And so here's a teacher. Let's go back and put that in context. Here's a person who's teaching something, and the fruits of their teaching tells you a lot about who they are. Well, here's some practice that I'm involved in, and what kind of things does it produce? What goes on that surrounds that? That tells me a whole lot about the characteristics of that action. The same thing is true with gambling. It breeds other sins in order to support the gambling. Those who are addicted to gambling, those who are compulsive gamblers, sometimes are involved in stealing in order to support their gambling habit. More about that here in just a second. The suicide rate among compulsive gamblers is much higher. The general population, at least some time ago, was 1.1%, where members of the Gamblers Anonymous, it was supposed to be somewhere around 13%. And so it produces problems like suicide, higher than the general population. The general crime in gambling areas, by gambling areas, we're talking about places like Atlantic City, Las Vegas. The crime in those areas is higher than in other parts of the world and country. For example, check forgeries, prostitution, tax evasion, embezzlement, illegal drugs, drunkenness, robberies, credit card forgery. Now, is that going on in other parts of the world? Certainly so, but it's higher in the gambling areas than it is in other areas, which suggests that it breeds other sins. And that's been the warning of those who fought against, for example, the horse races, or fighting against the lottery, or fighting against the casinos coming to a certain area, is because of the crime that it's going to increase in those areas. Do your study and do a little research on where they were bringing casinos in and see if there wasn't some opposition by the locals because of the crime rate that's going to be increased. It breeds other sins. So our question tonight is it a sin to gamble? And hopefully we've given enough evidence to convince you that indeed it's wrong. But let's go back and let's remember the three elements of gambling. There's an uncertain event, there is a wager, and there's a winner and a loser built in. When those three elements are there, it constitutes gambling. There it comes in different forms, it violates numerous Bible principles, and it breeds other sins. Hopefully no one present is guilty of gambling, but maybe that will serve to some of our young people as they face the question of gambling. What's wrong with it? Why can we not do that? What's wrong with buying that lottery ticket? What's wrong with playing this game? What's wrong with getting on the sports app and betting on my favorite team? What's wrong with that? Here are some Bible principles that help us with that. There may be one or more present this evening who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Would you repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're accepting in any way, would you come while together we stand and while we sing?